Are you experiencing estrangement? If so, you're probably experiencing grief. And grief is part of the human condition. We all grieve. We all go through periods of our life when we grieve. And the thing that makes us grieve the most is usually the loss of people in our lives, whether it's to death or divorce or estrangement or whatever the reason. Now, we grieve a lot of other things too. We grieve pets, we grieve friends in our life, we grieve jobs, we grieve houses, we grieve towns or cities that we grew up in. We can grieve a lot of things in our lives, but I don't think any touch us more than grieving the loss of a dear loved one, whether it's a family member or it can be a friend as well. I'm going to talk about this today, but especially the complication that arises when the grief comes from estrangement. Now, many of you are probably very used to the normal grief process, I would call it, which is that someone close to you has died. You go through varying stages of grief. It's according to different theories, it's 5 stages or 7 stages or whatever, but you go through stages, not in any particular order, but you go through shock and you go through denial and you go through anger or resentment or depression, and then eventually you come to terms with it in some way. And usually that is what happens when you're grieving a death, because the person has died. They're no longer here, and at some point you do have to adjust to that. You have to get used to it. Well, the situation is very different when the person that you're grieving is still alive. They're still alive, you still feel love for them, but you don't have any contact with them. And various things can cause that. Of course, you can have things like divorce, but usually people do recover from divorce because they realize that relationship ended. There's no reason to grieve it forever, and they move on in their life. But estrangement from like a child or a sibling or something where in a normal world you would have a relationship with that person, but you don't have any connection with that person anymore. And so that's a type of grief that I really think is different from most other types of grief. Now, for those of you who don't know me by now, I'm Allison, aka Elder Gal, and I worked for 4.5 years as a bereavement counselor. That was actually my first counseling type job. It was very specific, and I worked with people on grief. But most of the grief that the people I worked with were experiencing was because of death. And as time went on, and I went through different types of grief myself, I realized that there was a big difference between, again, grieving someone who has died and grieving someone who's still here, but you don't have any contact with. And in a normal world, you would have contact with. In other words, that's what makes it different from a divorce, for instance. So there's a special complication that can happen with this type of grief from estrangement. It can lead to something that I term chronic grief. There are many theorists that talk about the fact of something called complicated grief. Now, chronic grief could be maybe a type of complicated grief. Complicated grief is a chronic or long-lasting kind of grief, but usually it still has an end. And it arises usually out of someone grieving someone who has died under especially sudden circumstances, or like a murder victim or a suicide. Those kinds of things can lead to complicated grief. But I would posit that estrangement also leads to a complicated type of grief, a chronic grief that doesn't really ever resolve. As long as the other person is still alive and you're still here, you're going to feel this at least on a periodic basis. You may not feel it every day, but you will feel it. So I'm going to talk in a few minutes about some things that I would say are a little different about this type of grief, and maybe some things you can do. They're not necessarily different than I would tell somebody who is experiencing traditional grief, but I would say there are some things different about it. So I'm going to talk about those in a minute. So obviously, I'm no stranger to grief. If you've watched any of my videos before, you know my father died when I was 10 years old. I lost my grandfather a month later, a great uncle a month after that. And then I've had a number of other types of losses in my life, you know, divorce and estrangement from other people, like my sister, for instance. But none has hurt me more, none has affected me more than the estrangement from my adult son. And if you want to watch that video, I put that up about 9 months ago or so. It was 10 months ago. So I'm not going to revisit all of that because I'm not covering that again in a video. It was too painful to do. But I will say that that grief in general about the loss of my son, in the sense of not having any connection with him, any communication with him, has been and continues to be the most painful thing in my life. I have a chronic grief type of reaction to that. And so I know firsthand what that feels like. I know what it feels like on a daily basis. I know what happens when periodically it kind of rises up within me and just, it almost just paralyzes me emotionally for a little bit, you know, a few minutes or an hour or two. It will really, like, it's very unpredictable. Just somebody mentioning something about doing something with their, you know, adult child, or hearing from someone, you know, it can trigger this inside of us, and we're caught unawares. So that's what makes it very different from what I call traditional grief, because as you're grieving the death of someone, eventually, with time, that fades. And I think with the type of grief I'm talking about regarding estrangement, it doesn't fade the same way. I think sometimes it gets less, but then it can come back in a flurry, like it can just come back in a rush, and we don't know how to deal with that. So firsthand, I do know what that feels like. Believe me, I'm not just talking about this. The reason I'm talking about this, or big reason, is because I do understand it, and I do know what happens when that occurs, when you have that sudden triggering of that chronic grief. So I'm going to share with you some things I think that will be more helpful with chronic grief, even more so than traditional grief. I think these things are more helpful for especially a chronic type of grief. First off, when you're feeling this type of grief, kind of throw out the 5, you know, stages thing, because it's not really the same kind of situation after a while. It basically, you're stuck a lot. I'd say if you're stuck in any of those stages, you're stuck between feeling angry sometimes, feeling depressed sometimes. I think it's really hard to come to full acceptance, because there's always that hope that as long as that person is still alive, that, you know, maybe things could be different. Now, as much as you try to push that to the side and say, no, I doubt anything's going to be different. Like, for instance, my situation with my son, I really doubt there's ever going to be a reconciliation. But as long as we're both alive, I can't discount the fact that it could be different. So there's always that hope, which is a thing very different than when someone dies. So let me talk a little bit about what else is different, and also some things that you can do to cope with this. Now, because this is a chronic type of grieving situation, and it has like a periodic kind of nature to it. In other words, it's going to come and go in waves. You're going to have, maybe for months at a time, you're fine about it, doesn't really bother you, and then something will just trigger it. You could see a movie, somebody could say something, you could hear some music, something will trigger this. And then you're caught up in it. And hopefully it's short-lived, but we never really know. We never know if we're going to feel like that for just a few minutes or an hour or two or longer. So what I suggest is just be prepared for that. Be prepared for the unpredictability of it. So I say that, like I said, that first thing is really about being prepared for the unpredictable. Be prepared for the unpredictable with this. This type of grief is much less predictable than even normal grief, which normal grief is still unpredictable at times. So this will be more so, kind of like normal grief on steroids, basically. So be prepared for that. One thing I suggest that will help with that is to journal and have a specific grief journal just for the grief. So anytime you get triggered or whatever, make an entry, just kind of stream of consciousness, write down everything that you're feeling, thinking, whatever, whether it's anger or sadness or anything, just write it down. I think journaling can be a big help with that. And as part of that, as part of doing journaling, another thing I encourage people to do is at some point in this process, you have to really be honest with yourself about that relationship, about that estranged relationship, and really own your part of it. Really own your part of it. Because until you own that, you're going to be living in denial, basically. Because every estrangement involves usually two sides. There's two sides of the coin. Both sides have something to probably be honest about. And both sides have to be able to do this next part, which is after you've been honest with yourself, you have to forgive yourself. You have to forgive yourself for anything you did that you know contributed to that. And then let that go. And that can be a really good thing to work with in the journaling part of it. That can be part of that grief journal. So I think that's an important aspect to this that is even more important than in what I would call normal grief. Another thing is you've lost this person that is so important to you. Again, whether it's a child or a sibling or a parent or whoever it is that's really close to you. One thing that will really help is by reaching out and helping someone else. You're no longer being able to use that energy towards that person that you love so much. Then help others. Help other people in whatever way you're able to. So whether you're, going and actually volunteering at a particular organization, or you're donating money to a specific cause, or you're helping a specific person in need that you know, whatever it is you can do for somebody, be there to listen to them, give them rides. If you have a car and can drive, give them rides to the doctor or the grocery store or whatever. Or in my case, you start a YouTube channel, which is kind of my way of giving to others that I can't do. I can't, it's not received by my son. So I'm trying to do what I can to help someone else. So do what you can to help others, I would say. That is, I think, a really important part of healing this. And even more so than in what I would call normal grief or traditional grief. Another thing I would really encourage is if you feel overwhelmed by this type of grief, then seek help. At the very least, seek a support group of some kind, whether it's in person or it's virtual. Do something to help yourself connect with others who are experiencing something similar. So at least you know that, first of all, you're not alone. And second of all, there are people that can and will support you through this. And you can make connections with other people. That's probably more likely if you go to an in-person group, but it's certainly possible through an online group. So I encourage that. If things are really bad for you, then seek an actual therapist or psychologist to help you through it. Because sometimes if people already are suffering from depression or something like that, it may be even more difficult dealing with this type of grief. The next thing I would say about this is I'm going to tell you something that's really counterintuitive to most types of normal grief. In normal grieving, we tell people to don't stuff it. You have to feel it to heal it, as the saying goes. You have to feel it to heal it. And with normal grief, that is really true. It really helps speed up the healing process. So you have to put forth effort. Now, I'm going to make a disclaimer, an exception with this type of grief, with this type of estrangement grief, and say that there are times you may have to stuff it. There are times you may have to push it aside so you can function. And the reason I say that is you're going to grieve as time goes on anyway, in an unpredictable way. And so there are times when it's going to overwhelm you. And then there are times when you have to function. And because it's an ongoing type of grief, I don't really think that just feeling it intensely for long periods of time is really going to help you, because you're not going to be very functional when that happens. And it's going to ruin the quality of your life. So what I would suggest is you allow it in bursts. You allow episodes of this to bubble up. And when it bubbles up, then allow yourself to feel. Then allow yourself to process. Then you can journal about it, or, talk to, if you have a friend to talk to, or you have a support group or whatever it is. But don't live in it 24/7, because it will bring you down. It will bring you down so far that you may not find your way back. So please don't do that. Please allow yourself periods of time to grieve this as it comes up, but don't spend your whole time there. And I say that, like I said, as a bereavement counselor, I would normally not tell someone to do that. But in this type of grief, as I've found from personal experience, I can't be drowning in it all the time. If I allowed myself to focus on the loss of my son and him not being a part of my life, there are times it would bring me to my knees. But I know enough about myself and about this process to know that sometimes I allow myself that. Sometimes I allow myself a couple of hours to cry, or to grieve, or to feel the pain of it and journal it out, or whatever I need to do, and then let it go for the time being. Let it go for the time being, because there's nothing I can do beyond what I've already tried to do many times to heal this. So I hope that makes sense to you that are going through this. I hope all these things I've said might help you through this a little easier. Recognize this is not a normal type of grief when you're estranged. It is not. It has a different quality to it, and you will respond differently. So if you're estranged from somebody, and let's say your friends say to you something like, well, I thought you'd be over that, or whatever. You don't get over this. You don't get over estrangement, not while the person is still alive. You don't get over it. You learn to deal with it. You learn to fit it into your life in such a way that it doesn't cripple you emotionally, that it doesn't shut you down. That's what you learn to do. And the last thing I would say on this is what I say at the end of all my videos, which is you have to keep moving forward. Despite the pain, despite the loss, despite how much it can eat at you over time, you do have to keep moving forward. Put one foot in front of the other, emotionally and even physically, and keep moving forward as much as you can. And you do this because it will preserve the quality of your life as you go forward in your life. You have to keep moving forward. There's nothing more important, especially with this type of grief. You need really to do that. So I hope this has helped you today. I will continue on this channel to talk about grief periodically, but I don't discuss it all the time, but I felt like it was important to discuss this. I think it's an important issue. From all the comments that I get from viewers, so many people are experiencing this kind of estrangement. So I hope this helps in some way. Please ask any questions below in the comments, or share anything you need to. I really do read all of them, and I really would like to know what you're all going through. So until next time, be well, be kind, keep moving forward, and take care.